Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to a new episode of the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis on the state of affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. On today's episode, we have an interview that I did with Gidi Grinstein, who is the founder of the Reut group of Tikun Olam makers Tom, and is also the author of a number of books, most recently Insight, Peacemaking in the Oslo Process, 30 years in counting. And let me just say that Gidi was one of the few people who was at the Camp David peace talks back in 2000, was actually something like the secretary for the note taker and the integrator on the Israeli side of the team of those negotiations with the Palestinians, which was one of like the real last efforts to try to reach what we often refer to as the two-state solution, which today, so many years later, seems so far away. Afterwards, after the interview with Gidi, I'm going to speak with two JPPI fellows, Professor Yehonatan Givati and Dr. Sara Hirschhorn. We're going to talk about some of the latest politics here in Israel, as well as a little more on the tension with the United States. And the latest news that's coming out just in the last couple of hours is the speech by Senator Chuck Schumer, the majority leader of the Senate, calling on Israel to hold new elections and to replace its leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. And at the same time, the Biden administration imposing additional sanctions on additional settlers in the West Bank, as well as on some of the what are known as illegal outposts. So here we go. First, we're going to start with the interview with Gidi Grinstein. Gidi, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yaakov, thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So I want to talk with you. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. What's going on with the war, how it's being looked at, the diplomatic situation, your book that you came out with just before the war, which I want to get to, 30 years to the Oslo Accords. But I want to start with Tikun Olam Makers, which you run and has been doing some incredible work since the beginning of the war, dealing with some of the issues, the trauma, and finding basically innovative, amazing solutions. I was reading about 3D printers and coming up with ideas of how to help toilet seats in the shetach, like in the field, to prosthetics for soldiers. So walk me through what you guys have been doing and where the impact has been felt.
So the idea of Tom, Tikun Olam Makers, that came out of the Reut Institute, by the way, initially designed on the whiteboards, which is unique because most humanitarian projects emanate from the trauma or the need of the founder. In our case, there was a vision on a whiteboard that was effectively realized. But the idea was twofold. First is that the people at the bottom of the economic ladder don't get the innovation that they need. We all know it's kind of an axiom in the field that 90% of innovation serves 10% of the population, those that can actually spend money. At the same time, those at the bottom of the economic ladder are excluded, structurally excluded from the benefits of innovation. They don't get the products that they need at the prices that they need. So our idea was to create like a research and development arm, maf'at, in the kind of
which is the research and development arm of the defense ministry, right?
Yes, exactly. For the bottom of the pyramid, for the society's most vulnerable populations. And we quickly understood that this is actually, we hit on a global challenge, and therefore whatever we're able to do in Israel, we could scale globally. The second major idea of Tom was to build a platform for the humanitarian diplomacy, meaning for humanitarian relations, for relations between Israel and the Jewish people and other countries around the world. So it was supposed to be, it has been a platform for building the legitimacy, for expanding the relations, for and supporting small Jewish communities around the world. If you are, for example, in Panama, the Jewish community of Panama or Uruguay or even Mexico, 100,000 people, less than 100,000 people in Mexico, more than 100 million Mexicans. The probability of the Jewish community of Mexico to actually make a difference for the country of Mexico is near zero, except if they represent a global humanitarian project, if they are the carriers of these ideas that have been assembled from all over the world and they bring it to Mexico. In this case, they can move the needle. So one leg, one pillar of our project is real hardcore social impact, making huge difference for the lives of people at the bottom of economic ladder, those with disabilities, elderly and poor people. And the other side is humanitarian diplomacy, community relations, legitimacy surplus, building the fundamental legitimacy of Israel and of Jewish communities around the world.
So talk to me about what's happened since October 7th for Tom. What role has it been playing since then?
Like all other Israeli nonprofits, like all other Israelis, we had to pivot. We had to focus all of our energy and all of our resources on the needs that have been created by the war. As we know, there is the wounded people, civilians and soldiers. We had the displaced families. We had those who survived the killing, the atrocities around Gaza. And we also had those who eventually came back from captivity. So you had these four populations that had unique needs after the war began, after October 7th. So we took all of our energy in Israel and we focused on effectively delivering the solutions to their needs. And so there have been some highlights in this process. The first is that we have been delivering a prosthesis that is 1 pound, half a kilo. It's multi-purpose. It can be used for eating, drinking, playing music, playing sports, using a tablet, etc. It's parametric, meaning it's customizable to the stump, lagedem, and you put in the size of the stump, and then the software automatically adjusts the prosthesis, and it's going to cost 500 shekels, $150. This prosthesis,
which is nothing, right?
It's near nothing, because the high-end prosthesis can cost anywhere from $15,000 to $25,000 per unit. Consequently, the soldiers and the wooden people, they get the high-end prosthesis only weeks and months after they were injured. But our prosthesis, they can get immediately after the injury, as soon as they're ready, so they can begin the rehabilitation very early. We say that our prosthesis is the first prosthesis that they get on the bed in the hospital, and it's the second prosthesis that they have once they get the nice kind of Rolls-Royce prosthesis from the Ministry of Defense or from the government. They have our second prosthesis for all their daily needs that they can use at home. Also, usually the modern prostheses are electric. They need to be charged. Ours is not electric, and so on. So this is one product. Another product is there are children with severe disabilities. When their families were basically displaced, these children, usually in their home, they have a special toilet seat. In the hotels, there was no specialized toilet seat, but also there was one toilet seat for the entire family. So for a child with severe disabilities, the family actually couldn't use the toilet seat in the room. Just think about this challenge. So what we did is we took a standard kind of toilet seat from the hospitals, and we hacked it. We changed it in a way that it could be adjusted and adapted to the needs of a child, and it's mobile, meaning the family can put it over the toilet, the child can use the toilet, then you take the seat away and the other members of the family can use. That was a second product. Third is dozens of wheelchairs for toddlers, ages 2 to 4. Those wheelchairs are expensive. Many families cannot afford. It's rarely covered by insurance. And even those families that had one, many of them left these chairs behind. So our solution is about $100 a unit. We have distributed dozens of them. And actually next week, we have 3 distribution events in the South, in Haifa, and in Jerusalem. Again, probably 40, 50 wheelchairs will be given away next week.
Wow. Amazing. I mean, and from what I gather, what I like about this is it's the combination of improvisation, startup nation, so innovation, but with where, like you said, the people who are at the lowest level, the help that they require, right? It's putting it all together and making it affordable.
And on top of that, every design file, the files that allow you to manufacture these products, is documented, and it's basically deposited online. Yaakov, you and all your listeners right now can go to our website, download these products, and effectively have them manufactured locally. Where is locally? In a high school nearby, you probably have the ability to manufacture the wheelchair, the toilet seat, the prosthesis that I just described, and of course in universities and colleges around the world that have engineering and design programs. And a lot of people have the capabilities to do it in their garage, in their home workshop. We require very basic tools, very basic materials, and very basic skills. So everything that we do is designed for radical accessibility, meaning it can be manufactured anywhere. We want to make equal the access to our solutions between Nitzana and Mitzpe Ramon and the Arava, which is the most remote areas in Israel, and Tel HaShomer, okay? Exactly the same access,
right,
and also around the world. So that basically becomes, that's where it becomes a platform for global humanitarian collaboration, because the same access that you have in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, that access exists in Australia, in Japan, in Russia, in France, Northern Territories of Canada, or in Argentina.
So Gidi, you were recently in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates. You had been invited there to a conference that was basically, if I understand correctly, and you'll put in the right facts here, but it was some sort of conference celebrating religious tolerance. You had been invited because of work that you did with Tom, and you get on stage to give your keynote address, and you get heckled. And then there's a great response by your host. So why don't you just walk us through what happened there?
Right. So basically the conference is called the Dialogue of Civilizations and Tolerance. It's sponsored by the United Nations agency led by Ambassador Moratino. So those of your listeners who remember the history, he was the chief diplomat of the European Union on Israeli-Palestinian relations. He now serves in New York. But more importantly, it's sponsored by the Ministry of Tolerance of the United Arab Emirates. They actually have a ministry like that because they have figured that tolerance is not only an ethics and a value that is important for their society, it's essential for their national security. Okay, the fact that they have a tolerant society, and they believe that a tolerant society is actually a stable society because people are not quick to jump on each other's throats and quick to get to a fight and into an argument. So tolerance is deeply embedded in the UAE across all sectors of society. So I was invited before the war to participate in this, before October 7th, to participate in this conference and to speak about the TOM as a platform for humanitarian collaboration. Of course, it was helpful that one of the maxims, one of the ideas that inspired Tom is a teaching by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, who said that the best way to heal a broken society is to build things together. Meaning we believe that building things connects people, and we see it everywhere. In Israel, we have Jews and Arabs, religious and secular. We even have Israeli and Palestinian collaboration in building these solutions for people at the bottom of the economic ladder with disabilities, elderly and poor people. So the model works, and they recognize this. By the way, we also have activities in the UAE. We had in Bahrain, hopefully we'll continue in Morocco, etc. So we are, I believe, one of the only Israeli organizations that operates in all Abraham Accords countries and in the Palestinian Authority. And we had some activity even in Jordan. So basically, that was the reason I was invited. Came the war, and the first 2 weeks they sent some message of sympathy, and then the ground of operation. And slowly there was a lot of resentment, growing resentment in the Arab world. And then one day they scheduled a call with me, the organizers, and I thought they were going to cancel me. Who needs a kind of a Jewish and an Israeli person publicly on stage in the UAE? By the way, they invited me to also be a keynote speaker. And instead of what I expected, which is being canceled, the organizers said, hey, we want you, Mr. Gidi, they call me. We want you to know that you are welcome. You're our guest. We hope that you would come, you would submit your article to our publication, and you will speak in the conference. Please come. So of course I did, and I submitted an article, and the article actually celebrates the legacy of Abraham and Moses, who introduced monotheism. And my argument is that monotheism that is founded on the idea that everybody was created in the image of God, therefore it's essential for fundamental human rights. The work and the leadership ideas of Abraham and Moses are actually the cornerstone of all philosophies of tolerance around the world. That's what that's the key idea of my article, which also makes it it's not about the Jews, my article, but it does celebrate the legacy of our people as a cornerstone of tolerance in the world. Anyhow, I get there to the event. First of all, they really honored us. We were 6 Israelis and Jews all together, disproportionately represented in the conference. In the first panel, opening panel, after the congratulations, we're there. They give us the stage. They really respect us. And then there is the keynote. The following day, my keynote. And in my keynote, I basically said, by the way, I heard this idea from Lucy Arish, who gave an interview, and she spoke about how difficult it is to be compassionate after October 7th, the challenge of compassion, because we were so violated on October 7th that it's very easy for us to look the other way from the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. So I spoke about the challenge of our society to be compassionate. And as part of my explaining why it's so difficult for people in Israel to be compassionate to the Palestinians, that was my way of actually sharing with the audience in Abu Dhabi the atrocities that happened on October 7th. The raping, the killing, the brutalities. So at that point, there was one person in the audience that began to heckle me. And say, what about the Palestinians? Whatever, just disrupting my speech. So at that point, which is what you're referring to, and I wrote in my LinkedIn post that everybody's invited to read, the organizers came to him and said, in a very clear, rigid, polite way, it was an incredible moment because it reflected absolute clarity of thinking and mind. They said to him, sir, we don't do this here. The speaker is our guest. You listen to the speaker and you respect the speaker. And then when I came off and I walked over and the person was heckling me was there and the organizer was staying with him to prevent any further disruption to my speaking. So the 3 of us were standing there and the organizer said to that person, he said, look, I understand that you may be very emotional about what's going on the Palestinian side. But here in this conference was your opportunity to hear an Israeli and to hear about their trauma. And you should respect that. Anyhow, it was just an incredible moment because to me, this person, actually the organizer, they reflected the mindset of their society. And that mindset was so embedded in them that they were able to act so swiftly and so accurately and so determinedly. It was a beautiful moment. And then the following day, which was totally uncalled for, they gave me an award for my article and for my contribution to the conference. And I felt that this was really very special of them, very unique. In the middle of what's going on, to be able to say, hey, we see past the violence, we see past the conflict. Hopefully there is a future for everybody to be living together in the Middle East. Really an unforgettable experience. And thank you for allowing me to share it with your listeners, because I want your listeners to know there are people out there in the Arab world. By the way, the organizers were Syrians who live in Abu Dhabi. Okay, they're from Syria. There are people out there in the Arab world that want to coexist with us. They want to live with us. They want to learn about our culture. They want us to learn about them. So there is still hope for some sort of a peaceful coexistence in the region. It really
so I would love to end with hope, but I do want to ask you one last question before I let you go, Gidi. Look, we're talking at a time of great tension right now between the United States and Israel. And, I'm talking to you while you're in the United States. I'm here in Israel, but we're both seeing, everyone feels it, right? And anyone who's watching this and is a longtime observer of the Israel-U.S. relationship knows that things are not looking really good right now. What does Israel need to do? Or is there even anything that Israel can do, in your view, that can put us back on track potentially with the Biden administration? Or is it just it's got nothing to do with Israel, that has to do more with what's happening in the United States?
course, it's a systemic event, and there's very strong influences from the outside, but we are far from doing what we need to do in order to acknowledge what the United States and President Biden has done for us, and also to shore up, to strengthen the strategic partnership. We have to understand the American perspective. The most important thing is that the Americans are trying to build an alliance from India through the Arab Gulf, together with Saudi and the UAE and Bahrain and Israel and NATO. And in the eyes of all of the members of this would-be alliance, the Palestinian Authority is part of the alliance. The only entity that denies the entry of the Palestinian Authority into this pro-Western alliance is the government of Israel, specifically Prime Minister Netanyahu. So he is a stumbling block, not just in this debate of how to run the war. He's a stumbling block for building this regional strategic alliance for the Americans, which is essential for their ability to pivot their resources and to focus on China, which they see as the biggest challenge that they are facing. So the America was, as we know, was part of this grand pivot, moving its energy from the Middle East to the Far East. But then there was the war in Ukraine, another war in Gaza, and they are stuck. So we are kind of a strategic problem for them. This is number one. Number two, we are a political problem for Netanyahu, particularly with the far left of the Democratic Party. There is a big debate on how serious this problem is. I don't think there is a debate that this is a challenge for Biden. Now, what we should have done is very, very simple. We should have acknowledged the fundamental principle of the relations between Israel and the Arab world for decades, which is two nation states for two people. That at the end of the day, not necessarily tomorrow, not necessarily next year or in 5 years, there will be a Palestinian state, that the political horizon includes a Palestinian state. That would have released a lot of energy, bad energy around Israel. The second thing is that the Palestinian Authority, an upgraded and reformed Palestinian Authority, should be the one taking over the vacuum in Gaza from Israel. By the way, I think that we're moving there inevitably because we are looking at a disastrous situation in northern Gaza. Israel has effectively withdrew. There is a void. There is a humanitarian disaster. Hamas is being sucked into this whole area, so that we are going to have to rely on the Palestinian Authority. And by the way, because we're not doing it now, the price we're going to have to pay later for bringing in the Palestinian Authority will be very high. So right now, these are the three things that the government of Israel could have done to alleviate the tension. Acknowledge that there will be a Palestinian state at some point in the future, that the Palestinian Authority will be the one filling the vacuum, therefore that Gaza and the West Bank are a single territorial unit, and then and then allowing basically the economic side, allowing the UAE and Saudi to come in with the economic package to begin to rebuild Gaza, to at least offer a future of economic prosperity in Gaza. All these things are missing, so there's no exit strategy for Israel, and the Americans are really frustrated because they've gave us the backing for almost 6 months, and we have not been able to deliver victory.
And a lot of it seems to unfortunately be because of the politics here in Israel, and that is what's always
there's clearly no sense in Washington that Netanyahu is running the war based on the national security interests of Israel, that the political considerations are intervening all the time. By the way, in the Emiratis also, you hear it all the time. They're asking, who's in charge? How is it that the Prime Minister of Israel says one thing, other ministers, primarily Ben Gvir and Smotrich, say another thing, totally contradicting Netanyahu, and Netanyahu doesn't call them to order. They simply don't understand that in the Arab world. They can't actually understand that kind of disharmony in the message that is coming out of Israel.
Gidi Grinstein, I want to thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for everything that you do. We appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very, very much. I just want to say one last thing. The shock of October 7 is also a shock to the Jewish world. And the Jewish world mobilized around Israel. But there's not enough focus on the future and the vision and what that means for Jewish communities around the world. And that's probably another episode on your podcast.
And that we'll have to talk about, because you have a book that looks at the story of the Jewish people and what our future is. So we'll have to have you back, Gidi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so that was Gidi Grinstein talking about the basic challenges, not only of what with that was my microphone, not only what he's doing with Tikun Olam makers, but also what is happening with the throughout the region and throughout. And I think informative. I want to move to the panel with Yehonatan and Sara and talk for a moment just about the latest news that's been coming out of Washington. I mean, just in the last 2 hours, Sara, we've had the decision by the administration to impose more sanctions on more Israeli settlers and the speech given on the Senate floor. I can never recall something of that scale calling to interfere and intervene and basically for Israel to have new leadership. Talk about interfering in someone's political process. But let's just talk. I mean, you have written extensively on settlers and the hilltops, looking at it mostly from the American participation or American immigrants who were involved there. But I'm just curious. I mean, how do you understand what they're doing? Right? They impose sanctions on 4. Now they impose sanctions on 3 or 2. What is this?
To me, it seems like really a kind of red herring or distraction from the situation in Gaza and possibly from the general tension that seems to be extant between Benjamin Netanyahu and Joe Biden in this moment. We've spoken before on the podcast about my general feeling that these limited sanctions are mostly for show, although the legislation itself is expansive and could end up sanctioning far more than hilltop activists or the limited number of people who live in some of these communities that are engaged in violence. The nature of the sanctions is so vague that it could end up affecting really anybody that supplies these settlements in any kind of way, from the person who's delivering groceries to, someone who's works for the cable company, and that's very serious and goes far beyond, I think, what the U.S. administration's intent is. My feeling is that this generally is only going to encourage the Ben Gvirs and their allies, especially with possibility of new elections coming down the road pretty shortly, that anything that the U.S. says is bad is obviously something that's going to make radical settlers feel like is good and something that should continue. And I think it only empowers the most radical base here in Israel to continue the activities, but also to paint themselves as victims of the U.S. administration, which I think ultimately will backfire on the government. I think this is also an expression, again, of this frustration that Chuck Schumer vocalized today about the Netanyahu government and the desire that him and some of his most extreme allies will leave the stage. But this is a decision for Israelis to make. Over 70% of the Israeli population would like Benjamin Netanyahu to step down today, but it's not a decision for Chuck Schumer. It's a decision for the Israeli public.
And as the JPPI, I mean, we've been doing running polling that has showed just how low the approval rating is for Benjamin Netanyahu. But, Yehonatan, let's just think about this for one moment, right? All these, just today, we have that article in Politico, which explains what are the conditions or the terms that America would agree to an operation in Rafah. It would have to be isolated, pinpointed, limited, just against high value targets. So nothing of the scale that would lead to a toppling of Hamas. So basically, you're outlining a plan that keeps Hamas in power, essentially. Then we get more sanctions imposed on Israelis. Now, just so our listeners understand, not that I'm a sanctions expert, but these are people who are not in jail, right? Or they might be, but they haven't been convicted of a crime. They're Israelis that somehow they got some information about and they decided that they are suspected of some violence against Palestinians. So they decided to sanction them, right? No due process, no rule of law. And of course, these outposts, and Sara mentioned the complexity of what that means. And then you have Chuck Schumer's speech. So I'd say that on a day that Israel is hit with a terrorist attack in Beit Kama at a major junction down south. A terrorist attack yesterday, all this happening inside Israel. And then you also have, of course, the continued war in Gaza, the fighting in the north, and everything else that's going on. Do you agree with Sara that this is just going to further embolden the right wing in Israel?
So I think it's interesting, though. So there was a good column Amit Segal had at the Wall Street Journal today about what the administration imagines the Israeli public thinks. So I think I haven't listened to the full Chuck Schumer speech, but basically the idea is that Netanyahu is not representative of the fundamental views of the Israeli public. And if we could just move him away, somehow we'll get a better representative, someone who's a better representative of the public, and then things will change. But I think based on surveys, it's true that Netanyahu is unpopular, but his policies are quite aligned, I think, with the policies of the public. So to the extent you're going to get any representative who's reflection of the public, I don't think there's any common view among the public about not doing, for example, an operation in Rafah. So the idea that there's somehow you could like Netanyahu, dislike him as a leader, and whatever his problematic aspects are, but I think currently in what he's doing in Gaza, it's actually a good reflection of what most of the public in Israel desires. I think toppling down Hamas is a high priority, I think, for most of the Israeli public. So I don't think that this is going to be some magical medicine to the problems of the U.S. If we're going to have a different leader, I don't think things will fundamentally change. I think on October 7th, people realize there is a fundamental problem with the Gazans, and it's not about a specific organization. I think you speak to people who serve there on reserve. It seems like every single house, or a vast majority of houses, have weapons, they have propaganda materials. The idea that there's a huge gap between the public in Gaza, the common average person in Gaza, and the leadership, I don't think is supported by any evidence. So I don't think fundamentally things will change. The U.S. could start to force Israel to do things, and Israel will be uncomfortable in the decision it will have to make. But I don't think suddenly we'll have a leadership that, just like the prior speaker said, is going to aspire again to a two-state solution, at least in the near future.
Well, I mean, Chuck Schumer, by the way, talked about a two-state solution, how that's the only solution. And whenever I read that or hear that now, I mean, like, where were you guys on October 7th? Like, it's just not, this isn't where we're going. And to keep on, and I might want that, by the way. I mean, I've long advocated and written for personally, but like, you have to recognize reality. And reality today is that that's not going to be possible for the next generation or two until there's a complete de-radicalization process that is applied or goes through not just Gaza, but also the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria. And without de-radicalization,
yeah, I think if people knew, if you could guarantee to Israelis that there'll be a two-state solution with zero violence, I think you're going to have a two-state solution tomorrow.
Of course. But Israelis know that that's not what's going to happen. It's going to be the opposite. It's going to be a two-state solution with endless violence. And that's why, if we were more realistic and spoke about the need to de-radicalize, to wait, to have patience, which is such a crazy term in today's world, have patience, then you could actually get things done. Sara, you know, the criticism, though, of Netanyahu, and, you know, Yehonatan was just talking about how it doesn't really make a difference who the leadership would be, because you'd get the same policies with Benny Gantz, same policies potentially with Yair Lapid. But I think that one difference you would get, though, is the articulation of what the day after will look like. And here is the big difference between Netanyahu, Gantz, Lapid, and whoever else might be there. Netanyahu won't say two words together, Palestinian Authority, right? He won't talk about a role that they will play in the Gaza Strip. And this has the Americans, my read of it, very frustrated. Lapid or Gantz would be able to say that because they wouldn't be afraid that Smotrich, Ben Gvir are going to bolt their coalition. But Bibi can't do that. So is that partly what is getting the Americans all upset?
I mean, I would think so. Benny Gantz was in Washington, D.C. last week. I imagine he said the same exact things to the administration about the actual prosecution of the war and the intent, you know, for the operation in Rafah, as Benjamin Netanyahu would have said had he himself been in DC. But I think that they are hoping that a different government and a government with a different kind of coalition, coalition partners, might first show a little bit more sensitivity toward the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, make some efforts to speak more about protecting civilians, particularly in aerial bombing campaigns, to speak more about what the possibility is of actually eliminating Hamas. As Yehonatan said, Hamas is an idea. Hamas is also people's, friends and relatives and neighbors, and is not something that can be so easily separated from Palestinian civil society. And also something about the day after, though I'm not sure that even Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid could say with any more assurance than Benjamin Netanyahu that, as you said, that the two-state solution is anything that's going to happen in the near term. The Palestinians have a lot to do to put their house in order and to, frankly, rebuild civil society for themselves. We can remember that also Hamas is very popular in the West Bank. The next October 7th could come from 10 minutes down the street from me here in Jerusalem. And there's a problem with radicalization across Palestinian society and a new generation of leadership that needs to be put into place, either with some kind of unification of the Gaza Strip in the West Bank or otherwise, and to also prepare Israeli society for a significant change down the road. So I'm not sure that anybody can guarantee that the two-state solution is coming anytime soon. I think, as I saw on social media, the two-state solution the Biden administration also seems to be talking about is more about Michigan and Minnesota than it is about, Israelis and Palestinians. And I think we need to think about what things are going to look like here in the region and not just in the United States.
We should do a two-state solution with Michigan. Maybe
I should say that wasn't my line, so
right.
I can't claim credit for it.
The weather won't be. The weather would be a little different, but somehow I guess the Jewish people will figure out a way to survive. Yehonatan, I want to shift for a moment, just the conversation to politics and more precise to the vote in the Knesset this week on the new state budget. So basically, with the budget passing in the Knesset, Netanyahu's government is even more stable than it was before, right? Because this is always that issue. If a budget's not passed by a certain deadline, it does leave open the prospect of a government falling. But we see that if anyone thought that October 7th was going to lead to this government to fall, that doesn't yet seem to be the case.
Yeah, so Israel is a parliamentary democracy, just to remind everyone. And in some sense, the government is much more fragile than in a presidential system because you constantly need to get the support of parliament. I think the problem is that the members of Knesset, not the problem, the reality is I think they're reading the polls and the outside option is not very promising. So a lot of in some sense, the situation in Israel is very similar to the situation in Britain. So the Conservative Party in Britain is not very popular. All the polls predict that they're not going to do very well in the coming elections, but no one thinks that Conservative government is going to move the elections early. They're hoping something will happen. So even though you're not doing very well in the polls, you still control the government. I think the situation here is in some sense similar. The government is not popular. There have been some other political changes. So kind of the big political question, I'm not a political expert, but Gantz is extremely popular in the polls, but it's not clear if the popularity is because there's a lot of right-wing supporters who are disappointed with Netanyahu and looking for another person to vote for. And I think this is what Gidon Sa'ar is trying to pursue in
right, with his splitting from Gantz this week, right?
And I would guess, I'm not the only one who's saying there was going to be a new right-wing party which is going to attract a lot of votes. I'm not sure how many votes, but I think there'll be something along Gidon Sa'ar, Naftali Bennett, who will get the right-wing votes who are disappointed personally or of Netanyahu, but are not actually disagreeing so much with the policies that he's pursuing in Gaza currently.
But I mean, that's the craziness, right, of Israeli politics for a moment, if you think about it, right? Like when I look at Trump and Biden, I say, okay, two people who, whatever, put aside what you think about them, but very different policies. Here in Israel, and different personalities. Here in Israel, different personalities, but pretty much the same policies. Like, it's not like I have somebody who's saying, who's a big leftist, who's saying on the economy, right? Who's saying, no, I'm gonna create a welfare state. And it's not like, it's like pretty much everybody believes in free market. Everyone's a capitalist, right? Might be a little nuance here, a little nuance there, but it's pretty much the same. It's not like I have somebody who says, no, I'm going to let Iran become a nuclear country, or I'm not going to let Iran. Everybody is a wall against the Iranians. It's not as if there's anybody in Israel, I think, who would say, well, we shouldn't go into Rafah. We should let Hamas survive. No, everybody wants. So what do we even like? The politics here is really, it's just about, I don't like this guy, so I'm going to go for that guy, right? It's about people.
It's tribal.
It's tribal.
Tribal. I think in some sense, listen, I think the US also has that. So I do think a lot of people vote for Trump just because they despise the progressive left. And some people may, in terms of actual policies, agree with what Trump, but they just despise his personality and the type of people who support him. And they vote for that. So I think something along these lines happened in Israel. I don't think it's very healthy for society. It's very difficult for people to come to compromises because it becomes a zero-sum game, because you can't say, well, I have 10 things I want. The other person says, well, I have 10 things I want. Maybe we could reach a compromise. Everyone's going to get something. But if it's a zero-sum game about who control of power, I think it's very dangerous.
It's not even a zero-sum game. What depresses me the most, and I mean, just somebody who's been writing and covering this country for a long time, there's no policy discussion. In other words, there's very rarely a policy debate. So we don't grapple with the issues that really are at the core of what we need to do here. And I mean, take, religion and state, the IDF draft law, right, which is, the irony of the IDF draft law, when you think about it, is that if a lot of us probably thought that after October 7th, the greatest disaster in the last 50 years, the greatest number of Israelis and Jews murdered on a single day since the Holocaust, the greatest failure, no way the government survives this. Well, so far the government has survived this, and what's more likely to bring down the government is actually this religion state issue that we've been dealing with for the last 50 years plus and haven't been able to solve, and now it's coming back, and that's actually probably more likely to bring down the government than October 7th. I mean, which is nuts, because again, but that's a policy issue that we fail to confront.
I'll just say the equivalent thing in the U.S. is immigration. I would say that's another thing where.
So, Sarah, if just on this issue though of the policy and the lack thereof here in Israel, is that also, when you think about where the Americans are, is it just the upset with Netanyahu as his personality? He rubs them the wrong way. They're fed up with him, which, by the way, I could understand. A lot of us Israelis are also fed up with the guy who's been a prime minister now for the last almost 15 years straight, right? Except for that 1 year break in the middle, plus 3 years in the 90s. That's a long time for somebody to lead a country. Or is it also about the policies?
I think there's a few things that the Americans maybe are not capturing. First, this issue that we were talking about a moment ago about the splitting of the various parties. Actually, what happens here is that you have a lot of parties that all basically have the same policies, and all it does is create more instability in the system. We're not necessarily going to have a two-party system like they have in the United States, but there's a fragmentation of party politics here that isn't along policy lines. It's on other fractures in society, and all that does is create unstable coalition governments with one party that can withdraw and topple the government and have new elections. That doesn't really benefit the U.S.-Israel relationship to continue to have that level of instability. So the pushing to get rid of Netanyahu may be one thing, but they also have to understand what's going to come along behind it and whether that's going to create more stability in the relationship or less stability. The other thing I'd say is that the U.S. government seems to continuously misunderstand the nature of Israel's problems, not only in the Middle East, but also in and of itself. If the Israeli-Palestinian conflict disappeared tomorrow, Israel would still have extremely serious policy issues, including those that we've talked about: religion and state, the economy, all kinds of social, cultural, economic, religious, political issues that have nothing to do with Israel's relationship with its neighbors. And I think the United States need to also, take that into consideration in terms of the U.S.-Israel relationship, and understand that Israel's domestic problems are also as serious, if not more serious, than its relationships with the Palestinians, and to think about this in a more holistic fashion.
Very interesting, and I think that this is obviously a story that's going to be with us for some time now. But we can always hope that maybe we'll come up with some policies here in Israel. Although so long without, I'm doubtful that this is going to change. But I thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Yehonatan. Thank you to Gidi. Thank you to all our viewers and listeners. And you can catch us always on Mondays and Thursdays here for the JPPI Inside Analysis. In the meantime, have a great weekend. A Shabbat Shalom.